Hello, Year 9. This is Chapter 2 of the Falconers Knot. So I'll just recap Chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed reading it. So, like last week, we're going to read some of Chapter 2, and I'd like you to read the rest and give you something to research and think about. So, Chapter 1, Courtly Love. We found courtly love in this novel with the characters Silvano and Gervasio, and Silvano falling in love with an older married woman, Angelica, and writing her a poem. And then later on in the chapter, Gervasio reading the poem to her, quite Romeo and Juliet-like, from her bedroom window. And that's the concept of courtly love. Kings and queens, dukes and duchesses with courts, like people around them, like servants and other lords and ladies, would create the court. And if you were a rich lady and you don't get to marry for love, so you may have a crush on, or someone of a lower station may have a crush on you, but you are untouchable, they are untouchable. So because of their position and power, you love them from afar, and it's all romantic, like highly romantic, and everything seems amazing and wonderful because you don't really know them and they don't really know you. So everything's done but quite naively and romantically. Well, that's how it's supposed to be. But if you know the story of King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, so Guinevere married to Arthur, and for Lancelot falling in love with Guinevere, and that's a traditional example of courtly love, like loving the forbidden from afar. And here we have a young man falling in love with a beautiful young woman who's married to an older man, and writing poetry and everything being romantic. So we also have other characters that we met. So Chiara being sent to an abbey or a monastery with sister Euphemia, and we met her, and the sisters seem quite nice, so we're not worried for her safety, just feel sad for her being abandoned by her family, not to the streets, but being forced to live a single life, a life dedicated to the church. So the chapter ended with Angelica dreaming of the young men, and that's the end of courtly love. So chapter 2, red-handed, and that automatically makes me think about someone being caught, something is going to happen and someone is caught red-handed. So, chapter 2. Chiara rode beside her brother Bernardo, mute and miserable, on the way from Gubbio to Giardinetto. She had taken very few possessions, only the dress she was wearing, her undergarments, and the prayer book that had been her mother's. Bernardo didn't know that she also had with her, sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a few small pieces of jewellery. The pearl and ruby cross and the gold earrings might come in useful one day in getting her out of the convent. I expect he thinks he can give them to Vanna once I'm looked up with the poor Clares, thought Chiara, or sell them. It gave her a quiet satisfaction to imagine Bernardo going into her old room and opening the wooden jewellery casket on her windowsill and finding it empty. A cluster of buildings came into view as they rode down into the valley. It was a pretty spot, with the river winding through it and the bell tower of the friary chapel rising up among the whitewashed houses where the friars and nuns lived, surrounded by their neat gardens. True, there were more marrows than flowers to be seen, but even they looked charming at a distance. A broad circle of greenery, neatly hoed and tended. This will be my home, thought Chiara. It was somehow not as hateful an idea as she had imagined. Silvano was out hawking with Celeste. It was only a small hunt. A few local nobles gathered together by the Baron, and no other young men. Gervasio hadn't been invited. There was a dawn mist rising from the marsh, and Ettore the hound was splashing through the water, flushing out wildfowl for Celeste to bring down. It was a few days since Gervasio had read the poem to Angelica, and Silvano hadn't seen her since. He shivered pleasurably in the early morning chill, remembering her reception of his words. The geranium flower, squashed now, was tucked inside his shirt, where it was making a red stain and giving off a faintly unpleasant smell. That's possibly an interesting bit of symbolism there, and the colour red linking to the title. Standing by the tree where his horse was tethered, Silvano watched his breath forming little clouds in the cold early morning air. But the sky was blue and clear, and it would be another hot day, like most of the days of his life. He had the feeling that nothing would ever change, that he would always be young, that his life would roll out in front of him without adventure or incident under the blue skies of his native Umbria. A heavy hand clapped on his shoulder and startled Silvano out of his reverie. "Boo!" said his father. "I would pay to know what you were thinking." Silvano jumped and coloured up as guiltily as if he'd been planning a murder. "I could save my Scuddy, I see," said his father, much more loudly than Silvano would have liked. "Clearly there's a woman in the case. But regain control of yourself now. There are birds to be taken home for the pot." In Assisi, the friars were also up early, saying prime in the lower church of the magnificent basilica. So it's a prime is a type of prayer said at a certain time of the day, and Assisi is a place. So around their observance, the building was already swarming with workmen, from stonemasons to the most skilled artists from the great cities of Tuscany. Inside a chapel, one of these artists stood before a wall, red-loaded paintbrush in hand. This was in some ways the hardest part of any commission, transferring his vision from brain to wall, by way of the sketches he had brought with him. He knew how far they fell short of what he had in his mind, and no matter how much that image could be clothed in beautiful colours and his trademark embossed gold, it was the Sinopia that would lay down the outlines of all that was to come, and he wanted to get it right. "Ser Simone," said the priest in charge of the basilica, interrupting the artist's thoughts, "you were inquiring about more pigments, I believe?" The artist wrenched his attention away from the swirl of forms and colours in his mind. "Indeed, father," he answered. He had brought a good supply of already ground pigments with him when he came from Siena, but he had long since used them up and was going to need vast quantities more to finish the walls of the chapel of St. Martin in the way he imagined them. "There is a convent in Giardinetto," said the priest, "a house of poor Clares where they are skilled at preparing colours. They have been supplying the painters from Messer Giotto's workshop here in the lower church, and by good fortune their brother house of friars next to them has also started to produce pigments. Between them they should be able to meet your needs." "Excellent," said the artist. "And how far is Giardinetto from here?" "Only a few miles," said the priest. "It lies towards Gubbio." "Then I could travel there to speak to the colour master," said the artist. "I should like to do that as soon as I have completed this synopia. Chiara was woken on her first morning at the convent by the harsh clanging of the rising bell. The sisters rose at 3 to say lauds, the first office of the day, and again at dawn to say prime, but as a novice she was allowed to get up later. She turned over on her thin straw mattress and went back to sleep. It seemed only 5 minutes later that a hand was on her shoulder, shaking her awake, not roughly, but insistently. It was Elisabetta, one of the other novices. "What time is it?" asked Chiara, but Elisabetta shook her head and put her finger to her lips. So some religious orders don't speak at certain times of day. She waited, face turned away, while Chiara put on the shapeless grey robe she had been given the night before. Then she beckoned her to follow. Chiara was shown first to the garderobe and then into the refectory, where the sisters were already sitting at a long wooden table. So the garderobe is like the toilet bathroom area. Breakfast was taken in a strict silence, and it was not much of a meal, but Chiara was young and hungry. Her bowl of coarse porridge and cup of goat's milk vanished quickly. Then Sister Euphemia beckoned her and took her to the abbess's room. Chiara had not met the abbess on her arrival and was careful not to say anything until she was spoken to. She wasn't sure of the times at which the sisters had to keep silent. The abbess was tall, and what could be seen of her under her veil was grey like her robe. Her face was almost fleshless, the countenance of one used to a life of fasting and prayer. But her dark eyes were bright and intelligent, and Chiara instinctively wanted the abbess to approve of her. "What has that brute Bernardo done?" Abbess Elena was thinking. Looking at her new charge. Nothing less like a girl with a vocation could be imagined. She looked at you full in the face, forgetting to lower her eyes, which were full of spirit. Her pretty young face was framed by dark curls, and something about her brought back to the abbess a wilful young girl of some 30 years ago, who had not expected to be called by God. So is she thinking of herself then, or another sister? "You may sit down, Chiara," she said not unkindly. "How are you finding it here?" "It is pretty in Giardinetto," said Chiara, her voice already feeling rusty and unfamiliar, "but I don't expect I shall see much of it." "Why not?" said the abbess. "Although we are a closed order, as a novice you may leave the confines of the convent if you need to. You will be expected to work, and that work could take you outside the convent walls. As long as you behave decently and respectfully among the people you meet and remember your calling, you may still play a part in the outside world." This was better than Chiara had dared to hope, but it was still not enough to lift her spirits. What work could a poor Claire do that would bring any kind of excitement to her life? Tending vegetables or sick children would be very worthy but hardly romantic, and once she was professed, even that escape would be denied her. "When you take your vows in a year's time, you will have a new name," the abbess was saying. "We have chosen the name Ursula for you. You might like to start using it now." A tear slipped down the side of Chiara's cheek. In spite of her best efforts to stop it, she hated the name Ursula. Little bear, it meant. Why would any girl want to be called that? Her own name meant bright, and that was how she had always seemed to herself, like a candle in the darkness, like sunshine on a spring day. She had always managed to remain cheerful even in the unloving home she had grown up in, and now she was afraid of the convent snuffing her spirits out. Besides, Chiara was the name of the patron saint of the poor Clares, so why should she change it? But Sister Ursula felt like her destiny, a dark, shapeless, unimaginable form. She bent her head submissively. "And now we must cut your hair," said Sister Euphemia. Chiara looked at her in open horror. She hadn't thought about that. "It is the custom," said the abbess gently. "Not too short while you are a novice, but no sister may retain such flowing locks. It encourages vanity. There is no shame in it, child. It is what the blessed St. Francis himself did for your namesake, the founder of our order, when she chose to leave her family and follow him. There was no escape. Chiara would suffer enough humiliation having her hair shorn off. She wouldn't add to it by struggling. She took off her simple white veil and stood quietly while Sister Euphemia, who was rather short, stretched up to cut her hair into a ragged halo. The curls, no longer held down by their own weight, sprang even more wildly about her face. She felt literally light-headed and a bit cold. She was glad of even the flimsy veil to protect her vulnerable neck. "Poor child," thought the abbess, looking at the luxuriant hair on the floor, while Sister Euphemia took her charge off to instruct her. She bent down impulsively and gathered up handfuls of the glossy dark curls, feeling their weight and texture before casting them out of the window. "Let the birds build their nests with them," she murmured. Tommaso the sheep farmer was puffing up the hill from the marketplace to his home. He was humming to himself. His fleeces had fetched a good price earlier in the summer, and now his vegetables were doing well. And he had another little business that was thriving too. He would have significant wealth to leave to a son. Now that Angelica had let him back into her bed, he was hopeful that he might have a son at last. It was early afternoon, and there were few people about. Most were taking their midday meal, or were already enjoying their rest. It was not the time of day to fear attack, and, when he heard light footsteps behind him, Tommaso paid no attention. Even when he felt the blow at his side, he thought that some young bravo had just bumped into him by mistake. He turned to curse the careless youth and saw someone running back down the hill. His legs felt weak, and, looking down, he saw red flowering from his tunic. He put his hand to his side uncomprehendingly and sank to his knees. It didn't hurt, but there was a silver dagger hilt sticking out from between his ribs. He grasped it, and then the pain began. He was a few doors from his house. He roared like a bellwether. He looked up and saw a face he thought he recognized, a good-looking face. Tommaso clutched at the young man's arm, not caring that he was splattering blood on the other's clothes. "Murder!" he whispered, feeling his voice gurgling in his throat. "Murder!" echoed Silvano, gazing stunned at his lady's husband dying in the street. And then there was the sound of running feet all around him, and a woman started screaming. So, it's a dramatic place to end my reading, and I'd like you to carry on reading to the end of the chapter. So there we go. So page 23 is the end of chapter 2. So as well as finishing the chapter, it would be interesting for you to research frescoes and what they are, and what they decorate and how they were made and what pigments were used in them, because obviously Chiara, where she's gone to live in the convent, they create pigments. So historically what they were made of, so plants and minerals and things like that. So frescoes, painters, decorations, that would be a good thing for you to understand a bit more, and also referenced the patron saint of the order, so St. Francis and Chiara. So looking up Chiara and St. Francis might be an interesting story as well. So 2 things for you to think about: frescoes and Chiara and St. Francis. Okay, so I hope that you've enjoyed reading this chapter and that you're looking forward to the research. So submit it to your teachers when you've done it, and I will see you when we are reading our next chapter 3 next week. Thank you very much.